Hey everyone, Charles from Watch Charts here. I wanted to share a couple of housekeeping notes before this episode gets started. First of all, we ran into a few technical issues during the recording, so you may notice that the audio quality changes halfway through as a result. I hope this doesn't distract too much from what was otherwise a very interesting discussion. Secondly, this will be our last episode of 2022. We started the podcast this year as a way to build a deeper connection with you, the listeners, and to publicly share the types of conversations we're having every day at Watch Charts. I hope you found them enjoyable. Thanks so much for listening, and we really appreciate your decision to spend your time with us. Now, on to the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Watch Charts podcast. I'm Charles, and I'm joined today by Ben Wilson, who is the former head of product at the UK-based online car retailer Cazoo. And this is a little bit of a different episode today, sort of a crossover between watches and cars. I first met Ben in a conversation, a business conversation that was actually completely unrelated to the podcast. And as we were talking and as he shared a bit more about his background, I found that there were a lot of sort of interesting experiences that he had in the car world, which were incredibly relatable to what we were trying to do at Watch Charts here, for the watch world. Ben is an expert on the used car market, serving as Chief Product Officer of UK-based automotive startup Cazoo from 2019 to 2021. He was deeply involved in the development of Cazoo's pricing engine, helping establish the company as a leader in used car pricing and valuation. In 2021, Cazoo was acquired by Cazoo, one of the most popular online online dealerships for used car sales in the UK. After the acquisition, Ben served as the head of product data at Cazoo. So Ben has had a lot of experience working with data, working with market data, working with online sales information, and specifically working on the pricing of cars for the UK car market. And he started doing this many years ago, I think around 2015. But obviously, here at Watch Charts, we've started a bit later, and we're doing it in a completely different industry. But I thought there were a lot of really interesting parallels in sort of the challenges and, what it means for the market when a data provider, joins the market or gets involved. So Ben, why don't you share a bit more about your background, anything you want to add, and then we'll get into some of the core conversation.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I worked for a startup called Cazoo, that's based in the UK. We effectively, it's what was quite interesting when we first met was that the parallels were very strong in between what yourselves and Cazoo were doing. So ultimately, we gathered data from online retailers and car dealers, sort of the listings of the vehicles online, and we aggregated that data to then provide information of sort of like sales history, but also then later on to build valuation models that allowed us to kind of have at the time the first sort of live, at the point of quote, market ready valuation. A lot of stuff was month to month, and so when we launched, it was pretty much it was like the day, the hour that you were getting the valuation. That's what it was at that point in time.
And what was the state of sort of like the used car market in terms of the information that consumers had access to maybe before Cazoo? And like what were the initial motivations for starting the company?
Yeah, so it was founded by a single founder. I was kind of one of the first sort of 2 or 3 members of the team. It's a very small team when we got started. And initially it was we're providing used car. It's in the UK. It's called used car checks. It's very similar to the Carfax check that you get in the US. And so there's quite a few providers, and ours was unique in the fact that we had the sales history of the vehicle, so you could see kind of what a dealer had sold it at previously in time, and we had our own valuation data. And at that point, there were only a few other incumbent providers that were providing their own sort of product. And so it's very much kind of giving a valuation of the car and then tying that data together with all the other bits and pieces. And I think the interesting thing about cars is that like there's a lot of data around them, but it's all quite murky, and often it's quite complicated to understand the full picture of what a car is. And even between data providers, it can be quite difficult. So we aim to try and make that really simple for our users to do.
And when did the company get started?
Yeah, so it was founded in like 2015, and as a sort of a different business as Cazoo. I joined sort of late 2016 when we got some VC funding, and we decided to sort of rebrand and set off as a sort of a new business. And it was kind of the have two arms to it: the consumer side, so the car checks, and then also to help out businesses and helping sort of dealerships and later insurers understand kind of what a vehicle was and what the worth of that car was.
So that's interesting to me because, being in the US, I think there's been stuff like this that's looked at, online data and online car sales for actually quite a long time. I think Auto Trader, Kelley Blue Book is like the original one that's been around since like the early 1900s, I think. And then eventually they were part of Cox Automotive, which then also owned Auto Trader. And, Auto Trader was doing this sort of like price rating stuff of, telling consumers whether these cars were good prices or not in their online marketplace. Actually, I think for quite a long time, since like the early 2000s. Also, True Car was another one, I think launched like 2003. So I'm just curious, why do you think the UK market was maybe like a bit more behind the American market in terms of the level of information that consumers had access to? Or do you even agree with that assessment in the first place?
Yeah, totally. It's really fascinating, actually. So in the UK market, there were two incumbent providers and for vehicle valuations, and they, just like the Kelley Blue Book, they were literally just printed books. There were sort of tables of prices against mileages and sort of the vehicle taxonomy against them. And so, yeah, and they've been around for like 80, 90 years, these businesses. So, and what they did is they would take auction data. So they'd look at what a car sold at auction, and then they would extrapolate up. But they wouldn't do it particularly scientifically. And the thing that we realized is there's probably about like 2-3 million data points you get from sort of retail, versus it's kind of like a quarter of that in terms of like auction data points. So, really you're taking a smaller data set and you're trying to extrapolate it up to, all of the cars that are on sale in the country. Whereas you just take the data from the market, then you've got something that's much more accurate. Obviously you need both in order to be able to understand wholesale and stuff like that. But that was kind of where we were, we found our edge, is the fact that we're providing just this retail valuation. It's called retail back valuation. So if you knew what you were going to sell it for on your forecourt, you could figure out what you should be buying it for.
Right. And why don't you think people were looking at retail information before Cazoo, even though, as you said, it was much more, there's much more of it?
Yeah, ultimately because there was no unified solution, and it was just like, the dealer world, fortunately, is sort of set in the way that it was doing things, and it was just the way it was done. You just used these providers, so people didn't really trust another another provider. They're like, well, this is what I've been using for years. Even though they were offsetting it, they were saying, okay, well, we take this provider, but we've got to go down or go up by X% by default. So obviously it wasn't accurate. But yeah, so it was just they'd been around forever, and so they weren't really that motivated to change. I think really the big thing obviously was the internet, and being able to then browse through lots and lots of different sites and see your competitors much more easily in terms of what they were pricing their cars at. And so we were just the next natural step to be able to aggregate all that information together and very quickly allow them to value their vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds very, relatable to my experiences in the in the watch world. I think that, definitely auctions have a relatively large role in terms of sort of people, I guess, setting expectations or, getting idea of market trends in the watch world. I remember back in, I think, 2017 or 2018, there was like the big interest in vintage watches back then, and everyone was talking about these, insane auction prices that were hitting for like historical historically significant watches. Now, obviously, that's a little bit different than the type of auction market that you're talking about for cars, where it's basically a wholesale market, is my understanding.
Yes.
But I think the reason why that isn't really that big of a thing, as far as I know, in the watch world, is because just the number of SKUs, the number of models that are out there, and the amount of demand at any given time for especially a more obscure watch. The thing is, the market is very fragmented. There's not really like, a single go-to place where you can find, like, for example, a majority of the car market or of the watch market inventory. I would guess that maybe like the largest, sources where platforms where stuff is being listed, like eBay, or there's another one called Chrono24, they're probably capturing like, still a relatively small percentage of the market on their platform when you consider sort of the amount of activity globally. There's so many like mom and pop shops. There's so many, like dealers that are operating on WhatsApp, on Instagram even. And there's a lot of, private sales, right? There's transactions that are happening peer-to-peer, which no one's really looking at. So I think that that was sort of the main challenge, drawing it back to watches, in why no one had really tried to do systematic like price tracking and market analysis before watch charts, was just because there wasn't really a standard place, a centralized place to get all that information. And also a lot of that information was unstructured, especially in the private sales market.
Yeah, and that was definitely one of the challenges we had, was around sort of understanding what the car was and the data, like identifying it. Because obviously once you identify it properly, you can value it properly. And in the UK, we're quite fortunate. The UK government's quite open with vehicle data. But when we started looking at other countries, like in the US or in France and Germany, so it's a very different story. Trying to sort of piece together what a thing is much harder. And I think that's one of the key things. If you understand exactly what it is that you're looking at, then you've got a better chance of valuing it correctly.
Mm-hmm. And how much did you look at other markets beyond the UK?
Yeah, so we looked at the UK. That was kind of our main dominating market. And then before Cazoo was acquired, we were looking at the US. So we were sort of aggregating that data, and we sort of started building a valuation model there, and we're sort of testing out kind of where we could fit into the market. And then when we were acquired by Cazoo, Cazoo was in 4 other markets other than the UK throughout sort of most of 2021. And so we were looked at building models for France and Germany. And so, yeah, again, taking the data, understanding it, and sort of starting to build those valuation models so we could sort of use it in our own pricing. Yeah, it's a very different story. You're taking, the data that you're getting from a provider in a different language to kind of the one that the team's in. That was sort of a challenge in itself. But also, yeah, the data you're acquiring is messy, so we have to clean it up and make it usable.
Right. Were there any sort of like fundamental differences in like the way that you approach understanding that data between different markets, like some factors that, were new or unique to certain markets, or was it basically like the same set of factors, just maybe like different weights?
Yeah, it was the same factors. So like the cars across Europe are manufactured in a sort of similar way, and VINs generally work, like the VIN number of a car generally works in the same way across Europe versus sort of Asia or US, where even though a VIN is supposed to be standard, it's not. And so yeah, it was the fact that we didn't have in the UK it's the DVLA and the SMMT. They're the 2 like big bodies like that provide the data on every single vehicle on the road, whereas we didn't have that in Europe. So we had to go to another provider to sort of give us your best guess on what this car is, and then we fill in the blanks and use the other data that we had collected to kind of to help fully understand it.
Right.
And yeah, that's really the main difference is we didn't have the better starting point.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you guys really benefited from sort of the like regulatory information that was required to be provided and available to the public?
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
And it like any kind of information, it's kind of having it structured in a way that makes a lot of sense. That was the key thing that we needed to. We went to a data provider in these other countries because they already had it. In the UK, we built our own taxonomy for what the cars were, because like I previously mentioned, everyone had their different flavor of how they understood a car.
Right.
And so, yeah, just having that single, right, okay, this is exactly all the details on a vehicle, similar to how you would need all of the details on a watch, is super important.
Right. I mean, that's very interesting because I think, in the watch world, one thing that I feel like certain markets do a lot better than others is this like standardization of condition, right? I mean, condition is an incredibly subjective thing. I think even more so with watches because you don't have some like quantifiable specification, like based on, the number one thing I think of for cars is mileage, right? You can, if you build some sort of, pricing model, you can almost like estimate, the dollar cost of like every mile on a car, right?
Yeah.
For watches, it's incredibly subjective, especially in America and Europe. Like there's no standardized like, oh, what does like new mean? What does very good mean? What does good mean? And a lot of times potentially sellers will try to manipulate this information as well. They'll not necessarily describe it accurately. One thing I've noticed is that in the Asian markets, in Japan and China, I think they do a lot better job of standardizing condition for watches. So they use like either a 100-point scale. So they say, 100 is brand new, 95 is, like new, 90, 85, so on. Or I think in Japan, they use like a S, A, B, C, type of scale, right? So they say this is, amazing condition, it's an S, and then it'll be like, A plus, A minus. And it seems like it's been my perception that the dealers there are much more like systematic and much more maybe objective about how they evaluate condition. But that's always been one of the biggest challenges for watches is, how do you quantify condition? How do you really assess, what the condition of the watch is to begin with? And then how do you price, based on that? Especially since, as you said, it's really hard to quantify to start. So yeah, maybe you can talk about some of like the other challenges, or parallels in the watch world when it comes to evaluating, because you guys do have mileage, but there are other, challenges that maybe you don't, can't deal with as easily.
Oh yeah, for sure. So as Kazana kind of, we're providing, so the two kind of, when we're dealing with a car dealer, I always talk in two terms. You've got the car valuation, so this is kind of what it's worth in the market, and then there's the price, and that's the price you're retailing at. So the market valuation will shift, with depreciation or with market trends, but the price is kind of driven by you and your business logic, and basically kind of how you run your business on the thing you're selling. So yeah, it's how how you reach the delta there, and how do you manage the changes, but also how do you, when you're buying a car, so this was very pertinent at Cazoo, so that Cazoo would buy a car from a customer in a part exchange, or we would just buy cars off you just if you wanted extra cash, or you didn't need a car anymore and you were shopping around where you're going to dispose it, and that in itself is same problem. How do you get someone to rate their car in 4 buttons, like new, very good. So there's lots of things you have to consider, and so it's going into, like, traditionally a lot of those things will ask about things like keys, like does it have all the keys, has it got any blemishes or any marks or scuffs on the alloys. But like you said, for watches that's probably more difficult, and actually with the interesting thing around the car world is, and this leans more into the sort of insurance side of things, is a way to or a way that insurance looks at cars is what has the user done to the car? Do they smoke? Do they speed? And that in itself is what you can invoke. Okay, well, maybe there's stuff that's been done to the car because of these behaviors that they've got. Obviously, it's very different because you know, a car is a means to get about for people, as opposed to, you know, a luxury watch, which is sort of, you know, a piece of jewelry. But it's a very interesting problem, and everyone's trying to solve it for their own sort of bit of the world.
I think the really interesting thing that you know, I hadn't really considered was what you said about pricing versus valuation, right? So I think at Watch Charts we've been very focused on valuation. It's like, tell me what watch it is, tell me the set of parameters surrounding the watch, and we will do our best to provide an accurate, you know, market value, like what we think of as what the watch is worth, right? And, you know, honestly, before I've sort of like used those terms almost interchangeably, and I think a lot of people do, right? Valuation versus price. You know, what is the value of the watch? What is the price of the watch? I would say that probably a lot of consumers think about these things interchangeably. But the really interesting point that you brought up was, you know, pricing is more of like a strategic thing for an individual seller, right? It's okay, there's a certain market that sets the stage for what this watch is worth, but then there are individual factors that may affect, you know, how a seller may choose strategically to price their car or their watch, right? And it sounds like, you know, that was one of the maybe additional value adds that Khazana had to sellers, was not just, okay, here's a guide price, here's a market price for the car, but maybe based on some set of parameters, here's how you guys should be pricing your cars specifically.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So it comes down to sort of a few factors. So your traditional dealership will care about how long a car has been on its forecourt. So, or, you know, from the date of purchase to the date of sale, it's kind of this metric of days to sale is quite important to a dealer for many reasons. Sort of, you know, whether it's financing or just understanding like how long it's taking to turn all of its stock, but also like the kind of dealer that they are. So in the UK, at least, there are sort of different. You've got kind of your franchise dealer, which is, you know, sort of your BMWs and Mercedes, and they're sort of large dealer groups that have multiple franchises. You've got independent dealers that might have a few sites but they aren't publicly listed or anything. And then you've got car supermarkets, which are sort of just giant. You know, they just turn lots of stock. And so the difference between your supermarket and your franchise is a supermarket wants to just sell a car very close to what it bought it for, because it's going to make all its money on like other things like finance or paint protection or, you know, sort of warranties. Whereas your franchise dealer wants to make more money because it's an accredited dealership. It's also you know, you're getting the nice showroom experience. And so it's kind of all baked into that price. So they kind of want to demand more of a premium on the cars that they're selling. And so that's where we would come in and be like, okay, cool. Like, how much money do you want to make in this car versus how quickly do you want to sell it? And those are the kind of two paradigms that you work on. There are other things as well, like demand in the market, but those are the kind of generally the two that we started with.
And how do you convey to consumers, like maybe why individual listings are being priced differently, like based on the type of, you know, seller that it is? Is that something that's generally very well understood, or is it like there's sort of a trade-off, like you understand, okay, certain dealers are offering certain benefits, but that's also why they're being priced higher?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the kind of business. Generally, you'll know if you're going to a car supermarket because you're going to get a good deal on a car, but you're probably going to get fleeced on the finance. Whereas, you know, if you want to go and get a sort of a luxury German brand car and you want to have kind of the full dealer experience, and you want to buy something that's kind of a used certified car from one of the big manufacturers, then that's the kind of experience you get. And I think it's understood by the consumer that that's kind of what you're getting. The interesting part in that is online retailers and kind of understanding where in the spectrum they fit. You know, are they a premium, or are they a supermarket, or are they in between?
Right. And did you guys look at offline stuff at all, or was it just purely like online based pricing?
It was just online, mainly just for for consistency. So one of the questions we got quite a lot was like, oh, well, do you collect sale price, like actual sale price, which is obviously really difficult because you obviously need to go to every dealer and say, hey, what did you sell this for? And the dealer is going to be super sketchy because, you know, the price that they sell it for affects the finance deal that they've got, and there's all kinds of other things wrapped into it. So we went for the last listed price as the kind of the proxy for the market price.
Right. Yeah, that's, you know, the exact same criticism. One of the biggest questions, one of the biggest concerns that, you know, we get at Watch Charts, because we do the exact same thing, right? We take all the listings, we take a snapshot of the market, and once we've detected that a listing is sold, in many cases we don't actually know the final sale price, right? And people will say like, okay, well, how can you accurately, you know, estimate pricing if you don't know the actual sale price? And we do the exact thing. We take the last known listed price, right? But it sounds like, you know, for the car world, like this was already some sort of, you know, practice even beforehand, right? Because like you said, there was a big auction market, and then people would just sort of, you know, estimate some sort of additional premium for the delta between the auction price and the actual, you know, market price. It's a similar sort of thing with this, you know, last known listing price versus actual sales price. You know, that's what we tell people. You might do something similar. You might estimate, you know, based on whatever your perception is, what this, you know, reasonable delta might be, and that'll get you, you know, maybe closer to the market price. But yeah, how do you address those types of, you know, concerns when it comes to like establishing trust and credibility with, you know, both consumers and the, you know, dealers and other business clients that are using your product?
Yeah, it's a very important thing is trust in the value that you've got, and so it was mainly with our sort of dealer customers that this was kind of the biggest concern, because they know the market. They were very on it when they saw, well, you know, this very specific model of, you know, Audi A6 is way out of whack with everything else. So, you know, listening to what they're saying it was quite key, so we could sort of delve into kind of, well, okay, well, why is this out of sync? But I think, you know, going back to the point I made before, like understanding that, like, there's your value and there's your pricing strategy, and so the valuation that we would give, it's an anchor. So that's kind of you're following a trend, and that's what your pricing strategy is anchored to. So we can help you with all the other stuff around how you can price and all the kind of the tactical stuff around, like, as you're pricing it through time. But I think that's really the thing, is that the valuation is just kind of your starting point, and it's allowing you to know if it's going up or down in value. But it's not the only number. And I think this was the thing that we struggled with, is that the industry had been so baked into, like, oh, well, we've just got to know this number. It's like, well, the number changes, and you change that number depending on, like, what your goals are, your sales targets, those kind of things. So I think that's the first thing, is understanding, like, that's the dynamic, and, like, we can help you in other ways. But really what we did is we would help. That's how the proof is in the pudding. We would sort of sit down with the dealer and say, right, this is kind of what, you know, you've told us what your goals are. This is what we suggest. Let's test it out. Let's see how it goes, and let's see what works for you, and see if it helps or not. And when it did, they were happy. They made more money. You know, they were more informed, and yeah, and it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, you know, definitely a shift in sort of the dynamics of how people think about the market, right? Both the car and the watch businesses, you know, are often very gut feel, right? We get a lot of the same feedback from dealers saying that, oh, you know, how can these guys know the pricing? Because they just look at, you know, indexing listings online. We are in the trenches every single day, you know, looking at prices, selling and buying watches. You know, we know the market better than any of these guys. But I think the point is, like, you know, for these dealers, as I said, because the market is so fragmented, like, a lot of them are dealing with a very, very small set of data points, especially when it comes to the more, you know, obscure, more rare models, which are not even necessarily like the ones that are less desirable. Like, there's a lot of watches from Patek Philippe and Audemars Piguet, you know, it's just they're so low volume that a dealer might only sell, you know, 3 of these watches over like a 3-year period, right? They'll sell like 1 a year or something like that, right? It's also, a challenge on our side, even from an aggregate standpoint, because even when you're looking across, all the marketplaces, all the platforms, and all the listings, there's still maybe only, like 50, 100, 150 data points, right, in a year. And, the other thing, talking about again about pricing versus valuation is that when you're looking at the price that these are listed at on the market, all of those are reflective of some sort of pricing strategy, right? Especially when it comes to this very obscure stuff, how quickly does a dealer want to sell is a big driving force for what price they're listing at. So you can see this very, very large range. There might be like 10 listings in the market, but the cheapest one is like half the price of the more expensive one, right? So I think it's like you said, we're just trying to give an anchor price. And we also give a price spread as well in our own data saying, here's what we believe is the market valuation, and then here's a range. And obviously, if the amount of say transactions is lower, and if there's a big spread in the pricing, then that range is going to be larger as well. So I think that that's one of the big issues in terms of like how dealers and maybe other consumers are perceiving our product. And yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see, how do you, I guess that's a question for you, like, how was there any challenge in, convincing dealers to take a more data-driven approach rather than like a gut feel approach? And if so, like what was the evolution of that process?
Yeah, massively. It's very old business, right? It's very traditional. And yeah, there's lots of gut feel, and because there had to be. I think that's the thing is, until relatively recently, there weren't the tools that exist today. There wasn't the data set or the ability to crunch numbers the way that you do until very, very recently. So the incumbents that I talked about previously, they were manually creating these books. They were manually editing and tweaking the numbers. So that's kind of been at least in the UK, that's been the mainstay. So kind of moving to this fully automated thing is pretty scary in terms of, if you're going to bet the farm on it, you have to build the trust there. And I think, it comes from that. There are categories of things. There are things where like your bread and butter cars. So in the UK, like a Ford Fiesta or a Vauxhall Corsa, like super popular, they're just like the car that everyone buys because it's cheap and cheerful and it gets you from A to B. And then you've got your extreme sort of supercars that very similar to your watches. There aren't very many, and realistically, it's kind of like what someone will pay for it at that point,
right? Yeah,
because you just have so little data to go on, and those cars tend to be so they're so unique in fact that they'll have certain things or they won't. And then you've got the middle spread, and that's kind of where the bulk of the money is to be made, and that's where the data is important, because you can't. It's maybe not stuff that's as common, but it's not super rare. And so that's where your data can really help you out, is the fact that you can see market trends, you can see where it's changing. So, and at least you can just get some awareness of what your competitors are pricing those things at.
Right. That's really interesting because, yeah, I think there's a similar dynamic in the watch market. I think, certain dealers have reached out to us in the past and, asked us to, to license our data, for analytical use. And what we've heard is that it's, sort of like they're not really looking for help in pricing the super common models. It's more like the more obscure stuff, maybe not like the super like ultra high end, rare pieces that are, like you said, it's just, at any given moment, it's just what someone's willing to pay for it. The market for those watches might, change. The price, the value that you can get might double overnight if the right buyer comes along, those types of things. But it was more like, like this relatively obscure, maybe like less transactions, not like your Rolex, your standard like Rolex pieces or Omega pieces, maybe some other, less common brands that you see on the secondary market. What proportion of the dealer's business, or maybe of the car market as a whole, would you say is like that type of more, scarce type of market versus like the most common stuff?
I couldn't quote you the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's probably So the kind of the average price of a car we would see would be around £30,000. So it's probably quite a big. So like that is gets you into your like cheaper executive range. So it's like a cheaper Audi or maybe a cheaper BMW. So there's a good amount of it there. But obviously there are, you know, the smaller part of the market is quite broad as well. So yeah, it's a lot, but I couldn't give you a figure, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. What's really interesting about the watch market over the last few years is sort of like the discrepancy that we've now seen in terms of primary versus secondary market share. And I'm curious if that exists in the car world as well. My guess is it probably doesn't. But right now, what we're seeing is like when you talk about the most desirable brands, like, you know, Rolex, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, we did a report with Morgan Stanley about a couple months ago where we estimated that, you know, those three brands account for 70+% of the secondary watch market. And on the primary side, it's like much, much less than that. So, you know, I think what you're seeing in the watch market is this very, very strong concentration of demand in like a few specific references, a few specific models. And, you know, I think it's kind of unfortunate because there's so many, you know, watches out there. Like there's way, way more watch SKUs, watch models out there than cars, I would guess, right? And, you know, the vast majority of this stuff is, I think, just not really considered, not really looked at by consumers. Because like you said, you know, it is very much a luxury product. And when it comes to these mainstream brands, what matters to a lot of people is, you know, what name is written on the dial, right? What is the brand of the watch that you're getting? I'm sure that's true for cars as well. But yeah, I'm curious, maybe like if you can talk a little bit about, you know, what the dynamics there are.
Yeah, well, I think for a car, it's a bit different as it's a, you know, it can be a luxury item, but it is also a utility. So yeah, I think, you know, the brands that exist, sort of, you know, like Ford, Volkswagen, you know, they're all, you know, they're selling like hundreds of thousands of cars. But I think the interesting thing that's happened, especially that's happened over the last few years, right, because of the pandemic, is this shift in new to used car sales, in the fact that manufacturers had to literally stop making cars. And so your only option then was, you know, to be buying something that's used. And I think the cycle where basically people would buy a new car, it would be on finance for 3 years, and then it would come back into the used market after 3 years. You know, as not as many new cars have come into the market, it's meant that the used car market is dwindling, which is causing prices to skyrocket. And I think we're not going to see that stop. So, you know, it went from, you know, it basically turned into a game of like which manufacturer could pump out more cars in that time period. And so it was something ridiculous. Like Tesla was the #1 make of registered new car in the UK and for a large amount of 2021, which is like, they're very expensive cars, right? But it's, you know, it's kind of beating out the sort of the older, more traditional brands that you'd imagine you'd see there. And electrification as well is a whole other dynamic that is just starting to happen. And so that in itself is going to change the face of the new car market versus the used car market, I think, as well.
Right. I mean, electrification is incredibly interesting because, I mean, I heard this sort of parallel made, you know, recently on a video. I don't know if any of you guys are, you know, real like car geeks out there, but there's a great YouTube channel that I like to watch about cars called Savage Geese. And they do some super in-depth reviews, breakdowns, you know, technical deep dives on all of these different cars, both, you know, everything from your regular consumer cars to, you know, very, very expensive, you know, luxury cars or supercars. And they also do a lot of like industry coverage. They talk about sort of the state of where the car world is headed, both from a primary and secondary perspective. So probably my favorite, you know, car YouTube channel. But, you know, I think one thing that I remember I was watching a video and got me thinking about is, yeah, this electrification, you know, what does it mean for the car world? In the watch world, there's something that's known as the quartz crisis, which is when in the 1970s, the introduction of quartz watches happened and all the mechanical watches were rendered obsolete, right? Because quartz watches were much more accurate. They were, they ran on a battery. They were, the timekeeping was done by sending, I believe, a current through the quartz crystal, which would then resonate at a certain frequency, which you could then measure very accurately and use that to count, how many ticks, how many times it had resonated to then increment, the second, versus a mechanical watch was at a much lower frequency. Plus, quartz watches were much cheaper to produce. So, over that time period, the watch world, the watch manufacturers really had to reinvent themselves, and I think that's where we started to see, watches becoming a luxury product rather than a utilitarian product, right? And I think there's going to be a similar phenomenon take place in the car world. I think, cars are increasingly becoming more disposable and almost like just these big electronics, right? There's so much, not just in the battery, but also in like how the car is operated, the types of decisions that are being made, are increasingly made by computer systems, right? And it's also this question of, like, will the standard combustion engine cars become obsolete one day, right? And it seems like it's definitely going that way, given, the benefits of electric, both from an environmental standpoint, and from and I think just the general efficiency standpoint. So the question was like, will combustion engine cars become like, luxury mechanical watches in 10, 20 years, where I don't think they're going to go away because there's always going to be this enthusiast audience. There's people, still car enthusiasts that swear by, combustion cars, swear by, manual transmission cars and the, visceral feeling of driving, which I also personally agree with. But of course, from an everyday practical standpoint, you're probably going to go with an electric car, especially if the economics of that change and they become more affordable.
Yeah, I think it raises so many questions, because obviously with electronic cars comes like the automation question as well. But just for electric cars alone, we were talking to there's a research group that's funded by a lot of the key insurers in the UK, and so basically they invite the manufacturers to come crash test the vehicles, new vehicles coming to market, and they consume the data and feed it back to insurers to basically allow them to understand how insurable a car is. And so some of the newer manufacturers coming to market, the cars are uninsurable because if you crash it, even if it's just like a general fender bender, you destroy so much of the kit on the car, and right. It's expensive to replace.
Right. It's like the bumper has like, a bunch of sensors in it. The headlights are like, these fancy, exactly. It's like $1,000 for a bumper, $1,000 for a headlight. You just get into a little fender bender. It could be like, a good chunk of the maybe value of the car just to replace.
Right. And so that's kind of born from this move to subscription model stuff as well. So you have, I believe it's the Audi e-tron comes with a lot of the kit inbuilt in the car. And so even if it isn't turned on, it's on the car. And so if you're not paying for the subscription, you could at some point in time enable it, so it's on there. So it begs the question then: is your insurer going to pay to replace something that you weren't using on the car when you crash it? And so there's all kinds of questions around that, or things like engine modifications done with over-the-air software updates. How does you take your insurance policy out once a year? How does the insurer know that suddenly you've got an extra like 10 or 20 horsepower on your car? It's completely changed the risk profile of the vehicle.
Right.
So it's all kinds of really, really interesting problems that are going to be sort of presented, even with in accidents with electric cars, in the fact that because of how the cabling's done, and obviously like there's live electricity in the car, the risks are different around when you're rescuing someone from a crashed electric car. And so it has to be, has to be taken away and it has to be like cut into in a different way and stuff. So there's all kinds of things to, yeah, it's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, and let's just go on a little tangent here about this whole like subscription car feature unlock thing, because I think this has, yeah, I've seen some, mention in the press about this, and it seems, incredibly controversial. Now, so first on the insurance issue, is that just because like the car manufacturers, for economies of scale, are just building the identical car rather than like making different cars with different, I guess specifications? Is that sort of the underlying motivation behind the subscription service?
I'm not sure, actually. That cynically, you would say that that's why they're doing it, and obviously, it makes a lot of sense. But I think maybe there are tiers of, there's maybe 2 or 3 models that they have, and then those have features you can enable on them. But definitely, like in the news a few months ago, it was around BMW, I think, having like heated seats on the sort of the subscription of the car. And actually, the thing that within Cazoo that we were wondering was, well, when you sell the car on, how do you advertise the car? Because if you as the individual user have heated seats, are you selling a car with heated seats, or does the new user of the car have to? Is
the subscription tied to the car, or is it tied to the individual?
This is the thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's just ridiculous, though. Like, I don't understand. Is there like? Can you share a little bit about the logic behind why a feature like heated seats would be a subscription model? Because traditionally, I mean, we offer a subscription on our site, right, for WatchCharts premium data, access, and it's like there has to be some recurring cost to the provider to make it a subscription feature, right? Every day we're ingesting data, every day we're running systems to analyze data. We have to keep the website running. It makes sense. Like, I think it's justifiable that something like that has, continual new work put into it would be charged as a subscription. But if something is just like, a mechanical or electric feature built into the system, and it's just like a toggle, what's the justification there for offering, for charging it as a subscription model?
Well, I think it comes from lots of places. Cynically, you could say it comes from, a new revenue stream for the manufacturer. But I think it's actually born from manufacturer product teams sort of now in this whole new world of electric vehicles and internet connectivity in the vehicle. And what does that mean? And how can we, how do we build products in that world? And I think it's things are going to be weird. I think things are going to be really weird for the next few years as they try and work out, they're almost regaining product market fit in these spaces. You've got companies like Tesla that are kind of doing this model, and sort of they're built from the ground up thinking that way. Whereas these traditional manufacturers that have been sort of, they've been sausage factories pumping out combustion engine cars forever, they're now sort of fighting to get there and understand like what does it actually mean to provide this kind of subscription service. It's like I said, mentioned previously, it's kind of also born around things like automated driving. That's obviously a whole other topic, but also just like the connected car as a thing. So right. And we see this with lots of other things, right? In terms of the places where like your home, that used to just be sort of passive places, or you just live in your home. They're now active places where data is being created and mined. A car is the same thing. So I think this is generally kind of it. Obviously, it's a bit separate to the subscription. Why am I paying extra for my Xenon lights? But it's I think it's all kind of born into this, like people making physical products, big expensive physical products, are still like finding their feet in terms of how do they catch up with like software Silicon Valley world, but still maintain their identity and things like that. So I think that's probably why it's kind of, they don't really know what they're supposed to be achieving yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, like the cars are just increasingly becoming this new fancy like giant electronic. It's like a giant phone
exactly
now that takes you somewhere. And all the ideas around monetization, subscription pricing, over-the-air updates, that's just basically being transferred to the car world. And so that's why also I say it's increasingly feels disposable. That it's like when the new phone comes around with a new upgraded camera or whatever it is, the equivalent of it for a car comes around, then the old car, they're going to, I think the lifespan of the car is going to, in terms of like maybe how frequently people upgrade, is going to increase, and people are not going to be as, like, I guess, sort of attached to this more traditional philosophy of keeping a car like 7, 10, 15 years, right?
Well, I think it comes down to that, actually. The idea of ownership is completely changing around vehicles, right? And so you've got some manufacturers like Porsche, for instance, where you can pay them lots of money and you can be on the subscription, so you can just change your car. And there are other models like that, sort of kind of around the world, where you choose a subscription service. You pay, you say, right, I'm going to have this car for 3 months, 9 months, 12 months. And it includes kind of all the other bits and pieces around the car, like servicing and kind of vehicle inspections and stuff like that. And yeah, if you go and, when you get bored or you need a big car or you need a smaller car, you can change it.
So it's basically like a lease, but it's like even shorter duration, gives you the flexibility.
Well, exactly. Or yeah, it's like a lease that there isn't even like a bank loaning you anything. It's the manufacturer is just giving you the car that they made, and they'll take it back.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the crux of a lot of this as well, is that while this is happening in technology space, the idea of ownership is also changing, which is, yeah, again, super fascinating sort of area.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've heard this like increasing sentiment that it's like, we will own nothing and be happy. Right.
Well, and it's happening in other areas, right? So I've talked to a few startups in the last few months where so there's like clothing, like luxury clothing and stuff, like peer-to-peer renting of clothing, or just renting your wardrobe and then sort of sending it back when you don't want it anymore. So I think there's very much like this. The subscription market for everything is very much out there. So potentially for watches as well.
It's been tried for watches. Like, luckily, I mean, there hasn't been any I think subscription like unlock of some watch feature. I mean, because they are mechanical, but I believe Breitling, I think a year or two ago, tried a subscription model where it was similar to like you could freely trade in. I think some number of times within a certain amount of period of like within like a 12-month period or something like that, you could trade in your watch and get a different Breitling watch and wear it, right? But I don't know. Like I think we heard about that launch, and like since then I haven't heard anything about how the program is doing. I have no idea if it's how well it's doing. I would assume, because we haven't heard anything, it's probably not taken off amazingly. But it also kind of goes against like the very idea, which at least for me, of like what differentiates a luxury watch is this like everlasting, enduring object that will not become obsolete, that you will have with you for your entire life to build some sentimental value with, right? I mean, I think that's a big reason why a lot of people are gravitating and why the watch market has expanded over the last few years, is because it's sort of a refreshing alternative. It's a move in a different direction against all this like increasing subscription model type of disposable culture.
Yeah. And you see that very much the classic car market as well. I think is that there's still like swathes of classic car sort of fanboys in the it's like that super old, like very much the polar opposite of what's actually happening with the modern car market.
Right. So switching gears a little bit, we talked a little bit about the different types of car markets, right? Where you might have, I think you said like supermarkets versus, some other like smaller shops, and they have different strategies around making money. So obviously as a consumer, that affects your, that's a consideration to make in terms of, which avenue you want to go about in terms of how you buy your car. In the watch world, there's something similar, right? The two main ways of buying watches is you either buy from a private seller, maybe someone maybe someone on like a forum or something like that, or you buy from a dealer. And even within dealer world, within the dealer world, there are sort of different types of dealers, right? There's maybe like your, smaller, just sort of individual who buys and sells watches very frequently. They're maybe not technically like, I think they're technically operating a business, but they might not even treat it as a business. They just might say, I'm a guy who, buys and sells watches a lot. And then there's, these very, very large, multi-$100 million operations, like Watchbox, which will carry a ton of inventory, and they have like a very, large scale business. And, maybe for that, you're paying a bit more because there's a certain amount of trust, there's a certain level of confidence and guarantee that you get, when you go with a bigger dealer like that. But this takes me to the next point about the new Rolex certified pre-owned program. So on December 1st of this year, Rolex announced that they would be allowing certain authorized dealers to start selling Rolex watches as, officially sort of Rolex certified on the used market. And so it started with just one authorized dealer called Butcher in Europe, and they're operating in 6 European countries, and they're going to expand their business. Rolex is allowing other authorized dealers to join the CPO program, the Certified Pre-Owned Program, beginning spring of 2023. And so this now offers a sort of new level of, option in terms of how you buy used watches. Do you go for a dealer like Watchbox, or do you go for the Rolex officially certified way by buying a used watch from a Rolex authorized dealer? And the other thing that's interesting here is that Rolex has stated that they are allowing the authorized dealers to have full freedom when it comes to setting pricing, which in my mind, as I talked about in a video on YouTube last week, basically makes it sound like they're just rebranding, they're just white labeling the existing used watch business, for used watch operation for this authorized dealer into something that's like Rolex certified. And the prices are actually quite a bit higher. We compared the Butcher pricing of Rolex CPO versus the rest of the European dealer market, and we found that the prices were something like 15% higher on average for Rolex CPO. So I think, if you want to look forward as to how CPO is going to change the watch market, obviously the car industry is a great place to look, right? Car dealers, car manufacturers have been operating these sort of certified pre-owned programs for many, many years. So Ben, why don't you share some of your, just quick opinions, quick reactions on, what Rolex has done here, and what you think is in store for maybe the certified pre-owned world of watches in the future.
Yeah, I think the parallels are very, very similar. So when you're a dealer and you want to have a franchise, so say you're let's use BMW again. Oh, actually, no, like Jaguar Land Rover, I said JLR. So if you want to keep that franchise kind of name above the door, you've got to go by their rules in terms of how you refurbish the car. So using obviously approved kit, making sure that it's all sort of set up and the processes they're following are up to the standard that the manufacturer sets. That obviously comes with a premium. There's a cost to doing that. And so that ultimately it's kind of one of the justifications why franchise dealers will have an inflated price over, say, an independent or a supermarket. And so, yeah, it definitely drives up the price, because it means that then, that the manufacturer warranties can be, that they can be kept or renewed. I think that happens with Kia. I think if you buy a used approved from a Kia franchise, you get the longer warranty again, or they top it up for you. And so ultimately it means that from a customer point of view, you feel like you're buying from the manufacturer again. But from the dealer point of view, it means that you're kind of that you can charge the premium, but you're hamstrung by these costs. And so that to me is kind of I guess I don't know a huge amount by the Rolex program, but if they're sort of saying, well, these are the things you have to do and these are the things expected in terms of to meet our standard, then that's very much a thing that will drive up the price. And obviously then the premium, if there aren't that many approved Rolex providers, then it's like, well, I'm special versus another dealer. So you know, I can charge the premium. So again, that I could expect that would inflate the price as well.
Right. I mean, so there is this question of like, you know, what tangible difference is there between a certified versus non-certified product, right? So, I mean, in the watch world, you have these like, you know, Rolex certified or brand certified watchmakers that aren't necessarily employed by the brand themselves, right? You can have an independent watchmaker who's running his own small business who is certified by Rolex to work on certain, you know, models, and they have access to order Rolex parts, stuff like that, right? So if you go with one of these guys versus you go with Rolex themselves, what tangible difference might you get? And also, like, how does that work in the car world, right? Are there effectively independent shops or maybe smaller shops that will perform the same level of service, that will offer the same level of quality, maybe at a lower price? For Rolex specifically, it's a 2-year guarantee that they're offering with the program, with any watch sold in the program. But I think what makes me a little bit skeptical is that Rolex is not requiring any of their certified pre-owned dealers. There's no guidelines on like, you must perform this level of service. It seems like Rolex has stated that there's going to be service, there's going to be polishing if necessary. And that, to me, I interpret that as just basically up to the discretion of the dealer themselves on whether they want to do that. And if the dealer has a strategy around just taking in like really high quality, you know, pristine condition watches, then there's probably, you know, very little reason for them to ever have to do some sort of service. They could just offer the standard guarantee and, you know, hope nothing goes wrong, right? So I think that a lot of, you know, watch people like our audience have been a little bit disappointed by, first of all, the higher pricing, and then also I think, you know, sort of the seemingly lack of differentiation between the Rolex CPO offering versus a very trusted, you know, secondary non-certified dealer. Is that similar in the car world? How much extra value is there in that, like, you know, manufacturer certified process and guarantee?
I think it's different in the fact that the manufacturer stipulates quite heavily, like, you can only use this equipment, you have to do this level of refurbishment to the vehicle. It's like, it has to meet a standard. Whereas an independent dealer would want to turn it at as little cost as possible, right? So I think there is a difference there in the fact that you will get a superior product from a franchise dealer, and I think there are exclusions to the cars that can be in like a used approved program. I think like things around age can fall out, and maybe even mileage, or sort of overall condition. But yeah, so it is a bit different there in the fact that,
right,
if you go to a franchise dealer, you know you're going to get a potentially better product for a similar car versus going to like a small independent dealer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing is, like, you know, the Rolex suggested service interval, my understanding, is 10 years. So Rolex offers a 5-year warranty with their watches, and I believe the recommended service interval is 10 years, meaning, like, you know, with a car, you would service that every year, right? But with a Rolex watch, they're saying, you know, this watch is good for the next decade, right? So if Rolex CPO, you know, so there's a limit on Rolex CPO. You can't sell Rolex CPO for a watch that's actually less than 3 years old, because a lot of these watches trade above retail, and they don't want people, you know, buying it at the retail price and then flipping it, selling it back to the dealer at the used price.
Right.
But, you know, it's 3 years out of a 10-year recommended service interval. So what I'm imagining is that a lot of dealers would just take, again, these very, very, you know, well-maintained, like well-kept, high quality, high condition watches that are maybe like 4 or 5, 6 years old, and, you know, there's probably not going to be anything wrong with them, right? Because, you know, Rolex, especially with a program like Rolex, I think Rolex really has, you know, whether you love or hate them, like, they really have this reputation for reliability. And it's just a watch that, like, you know, you can wear, you could do anything with, and not really have to worry about, which is why I think a big reason also they have this mass appeal, right? They're not these things that need to be carefully maintained, carefully, you know, looked after. They're like the everyman's watch, right? No matter who you are, you can go and buy a Rolex, you can wear it, and it'll be solid. So again, switching gears a little bit, I mentioned at the beginning that Ben, I think starting from 2019 had, sorry, I'm sorry, starting in 2021, had started working at Cazoo after Cazoo acquired his previous company that he worked at, Kazana. Can you talk a little bit about, so, Cazoo being a online marketplace, not a pure data provider, what were some of the motivations around Cazoo buying Kazana, and maybe how your role changed in the new company?
Yeah, so yeah, Cazoo is a large online retailer in the UK. So the experience is fully online. So you basically go, browse, click, it's delivered to you. So it's very swish, very efficient process. So obviously, because they have got no physical, well, they do have physical locations, but they're not showrooms. They're customer centers. So you can go and drop your car off and pick your car up from them, but you can't go and browse cars there. So this allows obviously a huge amount of volume that they can do. And I think based on volume, it's like the third largest dealer in the UK, and they're only like 3 years old. So it's really ramped up. And so the way to do that is by utilizing data in a really sort of intelligent way. And so yeah, the Kazana acquisition really was kind of about taking the insights that we had and the data that we had and using them to sort of help fuel some of that scale that they had going on. And so as part of that, like pricing, purchasing cars and understanding what to purchase them at and pricing them, it's quite a resource heavy task when you've got that many cars, especially when you're sifting through lots of stuff. So the acquisition was for the kind of the technology and the smarts of the team at the time.
Mm-hmm. And so beyond using the data internally to price, are there any plans? Because I think I looked at the Cazoo website and I didn't see any price guidance or anything like that offered on each individual listings. And that, to the consumers was one of the big value adds of Kazana, right? Is that it offered additional information, additional transparency of the market to end consumers. Has that gone away now with the acquisition with Cazoo, or are they going to bring that back?
So actually, you do get a valuation on your car if you intend to sell it to Cazoo. And so that's done with all kinds of different data and logic. So if say you're purchasing a car, you want to part exchange your car, Cazoo will give you a value, and that's based on some data points. But also, if you just want to sell your car to Cazoo just outright, they'll give you a valuation based on kind of the things that you input. So it has come back, but it's less in an insights kind of way. It's more a practical, we're going to give you this much cash for the car kind of way.
So I was talking more specifically on the buy side, like when a consumer goes to the Cazoo or Kazana website, did you guys offer any insights in terms of how competitive the pricing was for the end consumer when they're looking to buy a certain car?
So for the Cazoo side, no, because it was we would infer the fact we'd be giving them the most competitive price for the service that we were giving. So, talking back to your price for, kind of your business goals and stuff. But I think where we as Kazana helped, we helped dealers with that in terms of we would give them an idea as to where the pricing was based on kind of the time in market and the type of car. Because in the UK market, so autotrader.co.uk have a huge amount of the market listed. It's like 89% of the market is on their marketplace, and so they have a customer focused flag where ultimately it will rank whether or not Autotrader think it's a good price or a fair price or a bad price.
Right.
And so obviously this then anything that Autotrader says is a bad price puts customers off. And it's not particularly sophisticated in the way that it goes about it. It's generally the lower prices are better. And so that causes a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of how cars are being priced. And so that's why it's a tricky balance, right? When you sort of your customers are dealers, but you're also trying to you want to be fair to the customer making the dealer provide a fair price without fleecing them and publicly showing what is a fair price is kind of the middle ground there. But it's because we were more B2B sort of style business as opposed to Auto Trader, which is a consumer business.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. At Watch Charts, we definitely focus more on the consumer side, but we also, look at dealer pricing as well. So we offer actually two prices for every watch on our website, or almost every watch on our website. We offer the private sales value, which is what you see as the market price, which is like what you could get, what we estimate you could get for this watch as an end consumer. And then we also offer a dealer price, which is like what we say you might expect to pay for dealers from a dealer. I think like there is some, obviously, yeah, there's a question of like the incentives, right? Like whether you're targeting, dealers as your customer base versus the end consumer. But do you think it's like possible to offer, transparent pricing and value to the consumer and to the dealer as well? Or do you sort of have to pick one or the other in your opinion?
That's a good question. I think the data set in itself, like back to it's the root, it's the anchor, right? Your market price is the anchor, and then it's how it's used after that is really up to them. So I think you as the data provider that's providing the market value, that's the fairest price you could possibly offer. It's then how it's used is then different. So ultimately, like we were providing prices to insurers as well as dealers, and they've got slightly different motivations. Similar in the fact that you've got we also gave valuation data to finance companies as well, and so that's very different to how a dealer would operate. So this is for like wholesale pricing. So a finance company wants the highest number possible there, and a dealer wants the lowest possible number there. So right. There's obviously some contention, and so it's like, okay, well, how do you manage that? Do you give them the same data set and have them both be unhappy, or do you give them a baseline and allow them to sort of change depending on other variables that they need to set it on? So I think it's very difficult, again, to provide one number that everyone will be happy with. I think it's giving that number with context and then adding all the other sort of decoration to it in terms of, what makes it fair for whom is kind of the other part of that puzzle.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we take a similar approach. Like we have different ways of breaking down the information based on who's selling it, based on where it's being sold, the factors surrounding the sale of the watch, whether the condition, whether it has box and papers. I think like we can offer different prices to different individuals, but it's all based on like the same fundamental approach, right? Like, so if a party wants to adjust the price after the fact, like that's up to them, but our goal is really as a accurate sort of market assessment, an accurate analysis, estimation of the market value for both private sales and for dealers. That's really our main goal.
Yeah, like I say, it's the anchor point for that valuation, and then where anyone else wants to take it, if they want to make money, if they want to get a good deal, if wherever they want to go, then that's for them to use that as the sort of the jumping off point.
So finally, let's end the conversation on maybe do you feel like the online car market is going? Cars, buying them sight unseen, I think is a development that has taken, has happened relatively recently, versus I think maybe watches. Like it's similar in the sense that there's definitely still some hesitancy around buying watches online and buying them sight unseen, but increasingly, I think you're seeing that become more and more prevalent. I really don't think there's that many pure brick and mortar watch businesses anymore. Like even if you have a brick and mortar store, you're definitely going to be listing your watches online. So what are the challenges that sort of surround the move to digital with cars? And what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think I think it is a car buying experience is a very physical one for lots of, it's a very emotive one for quite a lot of people, you know, and the fact it's a physical thing, and you need to, you and your family and all these other things need to fit into the car. So you've gone from this very traditional, like I can go, I can touch it, I can literally smell it, right? New car smell. That's like a thing that no one can recreate. That's like taking that online is definitely something that I think was a challenge 5 years ago. I think now we've gotten to the point where technology has supported enough, and it was kind of supercharged by the pandemic. Alongside, you know, we were in an environment where raising capital was quite not easy, but money was cheaper than it currently is. So there are some players in the global market now that have kind of managed to get themselves bolstered to a point where I think the momentum is there. And I think also in those new players plus the pandemic meant that traditional dealers had to get their stuff in order. So lots of digital solutions now for dealers offering this hybrid approach to how they do business. So I think it very much it's you know, it's a runaway train now. It's not going to go back to how it was. But I think I think there's probably only space for a few pure online plays. And I think, we'll see in the next few years how those go out, if they sort of consolidate into one mega conglomerate of, you know, online retailers. But I think the convenience is the best part of it, and I think that in itself, just from having worked at Cazoo, like the service was very slick and it's very well managed and very well facilitated. I think the biggest issue is always the customer understanding what they're getting and it not being the thing that they expected. So it's how do you as a retailer get better at providing that, and that just needs time, I think, to really get there. Right. So I think it's pretty inevitable, and I think there's all kinds of interesting things happening. So like Volkswagen having, I think, a play into direct used sales, so almost skipping the dealer network. But they also have like a Heycar, which is it's like a Volkswagen financial services funded thing that is like a marketplace for only Volkswagen brand used cars. So there's lots of different models that are being experimented with, but I think it's here to stay. It's just kind of the scale and the how it finally realizes itself will be quite interesting.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, the car world is already a lot further along than the watch world. I think even like 10, 15 years ago, people were questioning the legitimacy of the used watch market in general, not just like purely online, but also just brick and mortar. And, you know, now that's, you know, not a question at all. And within the last, 10 years, I would say, also there's been this increasing move to online sales. You've seen, big dealers pop up. You've seen, very big thriving communities of people who maybe started out talking about watches, but then decided to buy, sell, trade between each other. And, the audience for watches is actually young. Like, I think a lot of people think it's maybe like 50, 60, 70-year-old people. And obviously that's a certain portion of the audience, but, for watch charts, our audience mainly is like between 25 and 45. So, it's not just all these old people getting into this stuff. Definitely as the younger generation, I think, becomes more affluent and, having grown up with technology, it's going to become, only a bigger and bigger thing. So I'll wrap this up with a final shout out. Thanks so much to Ben. Anything else that you want to add? Tell us about yourself, anywhere we can go find you on, social media or something like that.
I don't really have, so I'm between jobs at the moment. Sort of having left Cazoo, moving on to a sort of a different space. But you can find me on LinkedIn. My name's very generic, Ben Wilson. But if you look up Ben Wilson Cazoo, I'm sure you'll find me.
We'll put a link in the show notes as well.
Great.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great to have you on. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks.